question, and you're certainly welcome to ignore this question and simply respond to what has preceded us so far in any way you see fit. But Mohsen made an interesting point early in his presentation. He said the nuclear deal had nothing to do with Iran's regional policies. That's a point, by the way, that Secretary of State John Kerry has emphasized quite strongly. In response to criticisms, why didn't you negotiate human rights? Why didn't you negotiate Hezbollah, Hamas, etc.? He said,
he didn't quote it. That's why I was pretty angry. Yeah.
I noticed that I've been quoting you extensively all day, Mohsen, because I don't want to get on your bad side. Or I should say, I don't want to plunge any deeper into your dungeon. But Greg, now, Mohsen, I think, is correct to say that the nuclear deal had nothing to do with Iran's regional policies. However, Saudi Arabia's reaction to the deal had everything to do with Iran's regional policies, did it not? And I don't want to preempt your presentation. You're about to give a keynote talk in the afternoon, which will deal with some of these questions. But I just wanted to put the Saudi factor in the equation in this discussion here. And of course, you are our resident Saudi expert on the panel.
Well, non-resident.
Is this on? There you go.
There we go. I'm going to come to that. I agree with many of the things my friend Mohsen said. I also think that the nuclear. No, stop right there.
Yes.
I think the nuclear deal with Iran was a good thing. I've supportive of it, and I think that it was a good foreign policy for the United States. I think that it opens up the possibilities of a more normal relationship with Iran that can have an impact on regional politics down the line, and I'm very much in favor of that. And I agree with Mohsen that I think that America's biggest security threat in the Middle East right now are Salafi jihadist organizations like the Islamic State and like Al-Qaeda. I don't think that they're an existential threat the way that we heard in some of the primary debates, but they are a threat to the security of American citizens. They're a threat to the security of citizens of our allies in Europe and in the Middle East, and they are an element of enormous instability in an area of the world that's still extremely important economically and politically. So there are many things with which I agree, but Mohsen would be very, I think, disappointed if I didn't disagree with him on a couple of points, mostly about his interpretation of Saudi Arabia, which he's among the most informed people I know about Iran. He's not in the top 1% in terms of being informed about Saudi Arabia. That's just me, actually, and a couple of other people. Yeah. So Mohsen told us that the biggest problem for the development of a rapprochement and a more normal relationship between Iran and the United States is that the U.S. sides with Saudi Arabia all the time. Boy, people in Riyadh would be surprised to hear that, right? You yourself told us, and I will quote you to you, that Saudi Arabia disagreed with the Iraq War of 2003, and you were absolutely right about that. You said that Saudi Arabia opposed the nuclear deal, and you were absolutely right about that, although once the deal was done, the Saudis publicly came out in support. And you yourself mentioned the Syrian red line. The Saudis, I've never seen people in Saudi Arabia more angry at the United States than over the backing away from the red line. Although I, like you, think it was a good idea to back away and not to get more engaged militarily in Syria. So I think that this idea that the U.S. sides with Saudi Arabia against Iran, and let's face it, the nuclear deal and the Syrian red line are about Iran, I think it's wrong. It's not an accurate depiction of U.S. policy. You left the distinct impression that these Salafi jihadist organizations, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, are funded by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf governments. That's wrong, okay? Everything we know, everything we know about the Islamic State's funding is that they are largely self-funded. through the imposition of what we might call primitive taxation, which is basically stealing from the people you rule in areas that they control. Their control of small oil resources in eastern Syria and in western Iraq. And, they're taking over the banks, right? Just the other day, the Pentagon announced a great fanfare that a great success because they bombed one of the banks that ISIS held and destroyed a bunch of the currency. It's certainly true that there are people in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, individuals, not governments, who have been funding these organizations, largely through Kuwait and Qatar. The Saudis basically closed down those funding streams in the post-2003 period, and that's what the American government officially says. The relationship here is not like the relationship of Iran to its clients like Hezbollah, the Badr Brigade, Sa'ib al-Haq in Iraq, like the Badr Brigade, and some of the Afghan Shia militias. There is not a government-to-militia relationship here. There just isn't, right? These militias, IS and AQ, they want to kill the Saudis. And I think it's a mistake for us to say that there's this direct financial support because it just doesn't exist. Then the bigger question, the more tortured question, the more difficult question is the ideological one. And this is something not only you brought up, but the ambassador brought up in his recent editorial in Project Syndicate. I think that this is a really complicated question. It's undoubtedly true that Wahhabism, the Sunni Salafi Islam, is xenophobic, intolerant, puritanical, and anti-Shia, without a doubt. Without a doubt. But is it revolutionary? Not in the way the Saudis deployed it. I think that the Saudis lost control of the Salafi movement in Afghanistan in the 1980s, when, through their support and our support, the Salafi tendency in Islam, right, was encouraged to become politically revolutionary to oppose the Soviets in Afghanistan. That's the origins of Al-Qaeda. Right? Al-Qaeda directly comes from the Afghan jihad of the 1980s. In the 1990s, I think the Saudis basically ignored this issue. And they allowed this jihadist spirit to be supported within Saudi Arabia because it was directed toward causes that were popular and did not put them crosswise of the United States. Chechnya, Bosnia, Palestine, kind of, that does put them a little crosswise of the United States, but the Saudis and the Americans always had this kind of, we'll agree to disagree on Israeli issues. So does this kind of Wahhabist ideological formation that one gets in Saudi Arabia encourage you to become a revolutionary? For some people, it certainly does. But what's the Arab state that has sent more jihadists to fight in Syria than any other? Not per capita, but absolute numbers. Does anybody know? Tunisia. Probably the most secular state in the Arab world. So the ideological connection here is incredibly complicated and complex. And I just put that out there as something that's worth talking about and further study. Are the Saudis counter-revolutionary in the Arab Spring? Well, yeah, of course. They were counter-revolutionary toward their allies, like monarchies in Bahrain, or like their close ally, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. But so were, as you said, so were the Iranians. The Iranians were counter-revolutionary for their allies. The mistake you made is to say that the Saudis were counter-revolutionary for everybody but Syria. Just incorrect, okay? The Saudis spearheaded the Arab League resolution encouraging military intervention against Gaddafi because they hated him. Everybody hated Gaddafi. They basically eased Ali Abdullah Saleh out of power in a negotiated Yemeni, it wasn't a solution, but it was an effort to get some transition in Yemen. And the Saudis negotiated Ali Abdullah Saleh out of power. They don't like him, right? It's not like they were dishing out one of their allies. But I think it's just a mistake for us to say the Saudis are counter-revolutionary, the Iranians are pro-revolutionary. No, I mean, this was a country-by-country decision that each of these places made about how to deal with the Iranian Revolution. All right, final point, because we want to leave like 30 seconds for people out there to ask questions.
Maybe 45.
Right. I think U.S. policy in the Middle East actually does have a grand strategy. And I think that grand strategy has been true since World War II, since the United States got involved in this part of the world. And that is to prevent any other power besides the United States from dominating the oil patch, right? It's not going to be the Soviet Union, but it's not going to be a regional power either. And thus, I think that it's a really good idea for the U.S. to have a more normal relationship with Iran. But as you said, the power, the regional power that has been most successful geopolitically in the Middle East in the last 10 years is Iran. Because of American mistakes like the stupid war in Iraq, right? Because of its ability to take advantage of some of the disruptions that have come out of the Arab Spring. Right? So Iran is actually the one power right now that might be able to, I think it's beyond its capacities, but that might be able to say, we could make a claim, we could make a push for regional dominance. And the U.S. is just not going to accept that. It's not going to accept it vis-a-vis Israel. It's not going to accept it vis-a-vis Jordan. It's not going to accept it vis-a-vis the smaller Gulf states where the U.S. has military bases, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the Emirates, Oman. And it's not going to accept it vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. I think that the U.S., when the president said the Saudis have to learn how to share the region, I could just hear Saudis I know saying, tell the Iranians the same thing.
Brief response.
I'll make it very brief. I think you said that the folks in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, are going to be shocked hearing that I said that the U.S. has been taking the side of Saudi Arabia against Iran. And then you base that on your claim that I know a great deal about Iran, but not about Saudi Arabia. So let me now reverse this and say, you know a great deal about Saudi Arabia, but unfortunately about Iran, not much, because if I go to Tehran,
Although I didn't talk about Iran.
No,
I talked about Saudi.
but you did.
About Saudi
But you
Arabia.
did. But let me tell you why. If you go to Tehran and tell the Iranians that, by the way, the U.S. has not been taking the side of Saudi Arabia, you'll be dead. Not physically.
I'm sure they're
but
more tolerant. They
no,
wouldn't-
I'm talking about intellectually. They'll laugh at you. They say, how can you say that? The point I'm trying to make, and the examples you gave, are not examples of the United States taking the side of Iran against Saudi Arabia. When the United States decided to go to invade Iraq, they didn't give a damn whether it is in the national interest of Iran or Saudi Arabia. They decided Iraq has become a threat. They're developing weapons of mass destruction, or for whatever reason, they went there. That was not a case where the U.S. had to balance the interest of Iran versus Saudi Arabia. In other words, you're confusing the fact that Iran was able to take advantage of American mistake with the U.S. siding with Iran against Saudi Arabia. There is not a single case that I know of, but the national interest of Iran and Saudi Arabia were involved, and the U.S. looked at Saudi Arabia and said, we're going to take the side of Iran. The Saudis opposed the nuclear deal, and the United States pushed for it because it was in the national interest of the United States to stop Iran from developing weapons of mass destruction. For the Saudis, they have a very parochial interest because they are a regional power. The United States is a global power. So the conflicts that you're referring to are not the cases in which the U.S. sided with Iran, are the cases in which the U.S. sided with the U.S. with a regional ally. Number two, I never said that the funding for the jihadis come from Saudi Arabia. I don't know where you got that information from. The video is there. Support is different than the direct funding. These are accurate words. Support means ideological support. Direct funding, I don't have any evidence. Indirect funding, yes. There has been substantial evidence, including evidence by the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, who said that our allies have been providing support for some notorious jihadist organization. I have absolute...
So their support does mean money.
There has been support from the Persian Gulf countries for the jihadi movements, but not directly from Saudi government, but from Saudi foundations, from Saudi individuals. That is a very, very important point. And regarding counter-revolutions and revolutions, I didn't use those words. The words I used, I said Iran was basically supportive of the Arab Spring, and I said Saudi Arabia in general was against the Arab Spring, precisely because Saudi Arabia is a status quo power. They have a monarchical system, and the one thing that they cannot stand is the possibility of change in the region. And therefore, they were on two different sides of the Arab Spring. And that side was reversed when it came to the case of Syria. And finally, the last point I want to make, I agree with you that there is this strategy of the U.S. having access to the oil. But with all due respect to you, that is changing. Fracking is changing that. The dependence of the United States on Saudi oil is diminishing. And most importantly, I believe the future of this country is not going to be in the Middle East, but the future is going to be in Asia. The pivot to Asia is going to take place in the next 10 years. And for that pivot to take place, Iran and the US have to come to an agreement. The United States cannot leave the Middle East, cannot lessen its commitment to the Middle East unless it finds a solution to diminish its conflict with Iran, and unless Iran and the United States find a way to manage their disagreements first, develop detente later, and ultimately develop normal relationship. For the course of the entire Cold War, the Soviet Union posed a much greater threat to the United States than Iran can ever do. The Soviet Union posed an existential threat to the United States. If we could have had normal relations with the Soviet Union, if we could have had normal relations with China, then I don't see any problem with not having normal, decent relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Okay, this is what we're going to